Welcome back to Job Code. In today's video, we are exploring the grid layout in .NET MAUI. We will cover how to organize your UI elements in rows and columns for a flexible and grid-based design. So let's get started. So what is a grid layout? In .NET MAUI, grid layout is a powerful way to arrange UI elements in rows and columns. This layout is perfect for creating complex designs with a structured and consistent layout. It is highly customizable, letting you set rows and column spans, fixed or auto sizes, and many more. Let us practice some examples in Visual Studio. To save some time here, I have already created a default .NET MAUI project and named it as Grid Layout Demo. Now let us add a page for this demo. So right click on the project, click on Add, New File. We will be adding a content page. So let's name it as Grid Layout Demo and click on Create. So by default, this page gets created. As you see, currently we have a vertical stack layout here. Let me replace this vertical stack layout with a grid. And let's remove this label control and add few buttons inside it. So our page is ready now. So here we have one grid layout, and inside grid we have four buttons named as button 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's set this page as our initial page during the app load. For that, we'll go into the app.xml file and replace this with our newly created page. We will save it and let's run the project to see what we have done. Now our application is running. Now here if you compare, we have added four button controls, but here you can see only one. This is because by default, this layout contains one row and one column. And the reason only one button is showing here is because when we added our first button here, it got added into our first row and first column. And when we added our second button, it also got added to the same row and column, making it override the first button. Similarly, when we added our last button, it got placed above the other three buttons. So that's why we are able to see only the fourth button. Now let's make some modifications to improve this code. So let's go back to our grid layout demo.xml file. And I will be using some properties of the grid here. There is a property called grid.rowDefinition. Inside this, we can add as many rows as we need. Let us set 4 row definitions here, one for each of our button. Let me copy this and paste it few more times. Now, let's add our each button into their specific rows. For that, we can make use of the row property of the grid. We can set the grid.row to 0. This will ensure that the first button will be added to the row 0 of the grid. Similarly, let us assign specific rows to each of the button and see how it changes the UI. For some reason, still I can see my button 4 is overlapping my other three buttons. So let's go back to our grid layout demo.xml file. If you see here, we missed to change the row numbers. So let me correct it here. Now let's save it and run it again. Now you can see all four buttons are visible here, and each button is being displayed in its specific rows. By setting the row definitions here, we have specified that we have 4 rows inside this grid. And inside each row, we have a one button control. Now, similar to row definitions, we also have something called column definitions. Now let's modify this UI by making use of some of the column definitions. For that, I will be adding some grid.column definitions here. Now in this grid, we have 4 rows and 2 columns. For keeping this example simple, let us remove these 2 rows. Now we have 2 rows and 2 columns inside this grid. Now what I will be doing is I will be assigning a specific row position and column position to each of the button. Now for button 1, let's set grid.row equal to 0 and grid.column equal to 0. Let me copy and paste this few more times. Now, as we have two rows and two columns, so we have four places where we can put our buttons. You can consider it like a matrix where we have four positions now. Let me show you with an example. If you see here we have two rows and similarly we have two columns. But if we use their combinations, here we have a matrix-like structure where we have four positions available where we can place our buttons. So the positions available are 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1. So now we will be making use of these positions and placing our buttons accordingly. So for our button 1, let us set row equal to 0 and column equal to 0. Similarly, button 2 in row 0, column 1, row 1, column 0, row 1, and column 1. Now let's save it and run it again. Now you can see we have four buttons being displayed in a matrix-like structure. So here we have two rows and two columns. Button 1 being displayed in row 0 and column 0. This is row 0, column 1. This is row 1, column 0. This is row 1, column 1. Now we can also set some spacing in between these buttons to make it look better. For that, we can make use of row spacing and column spacing properties of these grids. Let's go back to our grid and set row spacing equal to 5 and column spacing equal to 5. Now here you can see we have added a spacing of 5 between each row and each column. Now let us suppose you have a requirement where you want your button 3 to expand across two different columns. We can also do that using a property called ColumnSpan. So let's go to your button control and set grid.columnSpan equal to 2. What this will do is it will expand your button 3 across two columns. Let me comment this button 4 for now so that we have appropriate space for button 3. Now you can see our button 3 is spanned across two columns. We can also make use of row span if you want to expand your button across two rows. Let's do that. Let me uncomment my button 4 here. Let's comment button 3 for now. Now let us set grid.rowspan property for our button 1. Grid.rowspan equal to 2. Now you can see our button 1 is spanned across two rows. So you can use different combinations of rows and columns to create complex designs as per your wish. Now let us go back to our grid layout demo.xml and uncomment this line of code. Let us remove the row span and column span properties which we added. Now we are back to our initial grid layout where we have four button controls in two rows and two columns. Now if you see the size of these button is a little bit different from the usual size of the buttons we have. We can also adjust the size of these buttons. For that, let us use some properties of the row definitions and column definitions here. If we see here in row definitions, we can also set the height of each row definition. We can set it to different things. For example, you can set the height to auto. Now on setting the height of first row to auto, now we have the button controls in their usual sizes. Now what this auto does is, it adjusts the height of the row according to the control which is placed inside the row. We also have something called star. If you set the height to star and save it, if you see nothing happens because by default the height and width property is automatically set to the star. Now what this star indicate is, it allows the row to take up whatever space is available. It will allow the row to take that space. Now if we do the opposite, let us set this to auto and this to star and save it. Now you see the button 3 and button 4 are taking their actual sizes and button 1 and button 2 are taking the rest of the space. So when you set to auto, it will take the actual size of the control and star will take up the rest of the remaining space. You can also set absolute values for these height and width. For example, if you want the height of your row to be, let us say 10 pixels, let us save it. If you see now, it is taking the absolute values which you have set. So you have different options available based on your needs. You can use them. Similar thing we can do with column definitions as well. We can set the width property of the column definition. Let us set it to auto for column 0 and star for column 1. Now if you see, for column 1 we set it to auto, so it is taking the actual button size, and for column 2 we set the width to star, so it is taking the rest of the width of the column. So this is how you can play around with rows and columns to create complex layout. So I would strongly recommend you to play with different combinations of these height and width controls and create some amazing layout designs. Let us see one more variation of this. Let me set the height of row 0 to auto, row 1 to star. Let us set both the column widths to star. Now save it and run it again. Now here if you see, the height of first row is set to auto and second row is taking the remaining space. Similarly, for columns, we have set star for both of them. So both of the columns are taking the equal space. Now in some cases, if you don't want your rows or columns to take equal space, you can also set the value of this star to any number between 0 and 1. For example, if you want your first column to take 20% of the space and the second column to take 80% of your space, so you can do something like this. You can set the first column to 0.2 star and the second column to 0.8 star. What this tells us is that our first column is taking up 20% of our space and second column will take up our 80% of space. Let us save it and run it. Now you can see our first column is taking 20% of our space. The second column is taking 80% of our space. So using this, you can create different kind of layouts. So grid is the most powerful layout in .NET MAUI, which will help you in create any kind of complex designs. Now there is one more way to write the row definitions and column definitions and define their height and width properties, which will help us in avoiding writing this much code for just specifying the height and width. So what we will do is let us comment it out and we can specify it here at the grid control level. So here also you can do the same thing by setting the row definitions to auto and star. So we can make use of the comma separated values and do the same thing. Let us set the column definitions as well. Let's save it and see we have the similar design. So this will help us in avoiding writing this much of the code. So it is up to the user how they want to write it. Both of the ways are valid. Now let us see one example where we can create some complex designs using grid layout. In the interest of time, let me copy and paste some code here. So here I have a grid control where I'm making use of 3 rows and 3 columns to create a layout which looks similar to a website. In this layout, we have a header area, left navigation area, main content area, right area, and footer area. Let me save this and see how it looks. If you can see, we can create some custom and powerful designs using a grid layouts. To create this kind of design, I have just made use of the box views and label controls and some row and column span properties of the grid layout. So by shuffling these properties, you can create some cool designs in .NET MAUI project. So I would strongly recommend you to pick some cool designs and try to create them using the grid control. If you have any questions, you can put them in comments. I would make sure I provide the answer to those questions in my upcoming videos. So when can we use grid layout? Grid layout is great for building complex UIs with structured layouts. Use it when you need a grid-based structure. But keep in mind that simpler layouts like stack layout or flex layout may be better for basic designs. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more .NET MAUI tutorials. Do not forget to hit the notification bell so you do not miss any updates. See you in the next video.